Political Theology. Carl Schmitt. 1934. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Preface to the second edition, 1934. This second edition of Political Theology has remained unchanged. Today, after 12 years, one will be able to judge how well the short text, first published in March 1922, has held up. Even the contention with liberal normativism and its style of constitutional state has remained word for word. A few cuts have been made consisting of non-essential passages. Over the course of recent years, numerous new applications of political theology have become apparent. The representation from the 15th to the 19th centuries, the monarchy of the 17th century, which is thought of as analogous to the God of Baroque philosophy, the neutral power of the 19th century, qui règne et ne gouverne pas, which reigns but does not rule, up to the conceptions of the pure instrumental and administrative states, qui administrent et ne gouvernent pas, which administer but do not rule, all are examples of the fruitfulness of the idea of a political theology. The broad problem of the individual stages of the secularization process, from the theological by way of the metaphysical, to the moral and the economic, was dealt with in my speech on the age of neutralization and depoliticization, October 1929, in Barcelona. Among Protestant theologians, Heinrich Versthoff and Friedrich Gaugarten especially have shown that without the concept of secularization, an understanding of the last few centuries of our history is totally impossible. Admittedly, Protestant theology posits a different, supposedly apolitical, doctrine of God as wholly other, just as political liberalism, state and politics are wholly other. In the meantime, we have acknowledged the political as the total, and as a result of which acknowledged also that the decision about whether something is apolitical always means a political decision, regardless of who decides and what arguments it is dressed up with. This applies also for the question of whether a particular theology is political or apolitical. I would like to elaborate on the remarks on Hobbes regarding the two types of juristic thought at the end of the second chapter, because these questions concern my career as a professor of law. I would today distinguish not two but three types of legal thought. Aside from the normativist and the decisionist types, there is also the institutional type. The discussion on my theory of institutional guarantees in German jurisprudence, as well as Maurice Horiou's profound and significant theory of institutions, have provided me this insight. While the pure normativist thinks in impersonal rules, and the decisionist carries out the good law of the correctly recognized political situation by means of a personal decision, institutional legal thought unfolds in institutions and organizations beyond the personal sphere. And while the normativist distorts and reduces the law to a mere mode of operation of a state bureaucracy, and the decisionist is always in danger of missing the latent essence contained in every great political movement due to preoccupation with the moment, isolated institutional thinking leads to the pluralism of feudal corporate growth bereft of sovereignty. And so the three spheres and elements of political unity, state, movement, people, can be associated with the three types of juristic thought in their health as well as their degenerated forms. The so-called positivism and normativism of the German constitutional doctrine of the Wilhelmine and Weimar eras is only a normativism degenerated and therefore self-contradictory due to, instead of resting on natural or rational law, merely being attached to factually valid norms. This normativism was mingled with type of positivism that was only a degenerated decisionism that was blind to the law, clinging to the normative power of the factual instead of to a genuine decision. This formless and unformable mixture was no match for any serious problem of state and constitution. This last epoch of German public law is characterized by the fact that the answer to the decisive case remains unsolved, namely the Prussian constitutional conflict with Bismarck, as a result of which the solutions to all further decisive cases remain unsolved. In order to avoid the decision, a phrase for such cases was coined which backfired on itself and yet which is still carried as a motto: public law stops here. Berlin, November 1933, Carl Schmitt. 1. Definition of sovereignty. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception. This definition alone can do justice to the concept of sovereignty as a limiting concept. Limiting concept does not mean a vague concept, as in the inexact terminology of popular literature, but rather a concept of the outermost sphere. Accordingly, this definition cannot be associated with the general case, but rather with a borderline case. It will become clear from the following that the state of exception must be understood as a general concept in the theory of state, not just a result of any emergency decree or state of siege. That the state of exception is eminently suitable for the juristic definition of sovereignty has a systematic, legally logical rationale. A decision regarding the exception is a decision in the eminent sense of the term, for a general norm, as represented by a normal legal proposition, can never encompass a total exception, and therefore also cannot completely justify the decision that a true state of exception exists. When Robert von Moll, Monographine, page 626, says that the test of whether an emergency exists cannot be a juristic one, he assumes the premise that a decision in the legal sense must derive completely from the content of a norm. But that is the question. In the general sense in which Moll articulates the proposition, it is only an expression of constitutional liberalism, and underestimates the independent significance of the decision itself. The abstract scheme established as the definition of sovereignty, that it is the highest power, not a derived power, can be accepted or not, without making a great practical or theoretical difference. About a concept in itself there will generally not be much argument, least of all in the history of sovereignty. One argues about the concrete application, and that means who decides what constitutes the public or state interests, public safety, and order, le salut public, etc. in case of a conflict. The state of exception, which is not circumscribed in the existing legal order, can at best be designated as a case of the most extreme emergency, a threat to the existence of the state or the like, but cannot be circumscribed matter-of-factly. This is precisely what makes relevant the question of the subject of sovereignty, that is the question of sovereignty overall. It can neither be stated with subsumable clarity when an emergency will exist, nor can it be substantially enumerated what might happen in such a case when it truly comes to an extreme emergency and its elimination. Precondition, as well as content of competence, are here necessarily unlimited. In the sense of the constitutional state, there is no competence at all. At best, the Constitution can state who can act in such a case. If this action is not subject to any controls, distributed in some way in a system of checks and balances, as in the case of a liberal constitution, then it will quickly become clear who the sovereign is. He will decide immediately whether an extreme emergency exists, as well as what should be done to eliminate it. He will stand outside of the normally valid legal system and yet belong to it, for he is responsible for the decision as to whether the Constitution can be suspended entirely. All tendencies in the development of the modern constitutional state are towards eliminating the sovereign in this sense. Therein lie the consequences of the ideas of Krabbe and Kelsen, which will be dealt with in the following chapter. But the question of whether the extreme state of exception can be eliminated is not a juristic one. Whether one holds the belief and the hope that it can be eliminated depends on philosophical, especially historic philosophical or metaphysical convictions. There are historical depictions of the development of the concept of sovereignty, but they settle for the assembly of abstract formulae in which, as in a textbook, the definitions of sovereignty are contained. None seem to have made the effort to more closely examine the endlessly repeated, completely empty clichés used to refer to the highest power among the famous authors of the concept of sovereignty. That this concept is orientated toward the critical case, that is, the exception, was already apparent in Bodin. More than with his oft-cited definition, la souveraineté est la puissance absolue et perpétuelle d'une république, sovereignty is the absolute and perpetual power of a republic, he marked the beginning of the modern theory of state with his work of the True Marks of Sovereignty, chapter 10 of the first book of Republic. He discussed his concept using many practical examples and always returned to the same question: to what extent is the sovereign bound to laws, and responsible to the estates? To this last, especially important question, Bodin replies that commitments are binding because the obligatory strength of a commitment rests on natural law. In the case of emergent, the bond to general natural principles ceases. Generally, he says, the ruler is responsible to the estates or the people only so long as the fulfillment of his commitment is in the interest of the people, but that he is not so bound si la nécessité est urgente, if the necessity is urgent. The deciding factor in Bodin's proposition is that he brings the discussion of the relationship between ruler and estates to a simple either-or, and indeed this is because he refers to the emergency. This was the truly impressive aspect of his definition, which considered sovereignty to be an indivisible unit, and finally settled the question of power in the state. His scholarly achievement and the reason for his success lie in his incorporation of the decision into the concept of sovereignty. Today there is hardly any discussion of the concept of sovereignty in which the usual quotation from Bodin does not feature, but nowhere does one find the core quote from the core of that chapter cited. Bodin asks whether the promises that the ruler gives to the estates or the people override his sovereignty. He answers by referring to the case when it becomes necessary to counteract such promises, to amend or completely override the laws, selon l'exigence des cas, des temps, et des personnes according to the demands of the case, the laws, and the people. If in such a case the ruler must first ask permission of a senate or the people, he must be prepared to let his subjects dispense with him. This seems to Bodin an absurdity, for he holds that since the estates are also not masters over the law, they would in turn have to allow their ruler to dispense with them, and so sovereignty would become jouer à deux parties, a play between two parties. Sometimes the people would be master, sometimes the ruler, and that is contrary to all reason and justice. That is why the authority to suspend normally valid law, be this in general or in a particular case, is so much the true mark of sovereignty that Bowdoin derives all other features from it: declaration of war or peace agreement, appointment of officials, last resort, right to grant pardon, and so on. In my book on dictatorship, Die Diktator, Munich and Leipzig, 1921, I showed, in contrast to the traditional schema of historical representations, that even among the authors of natural law in the 17th century, the question of sovereignty was understood as the question as to the decision on the state of exception. This goes especially for Samuel von Pufendorf. Everyone agrees that when antagonisms appear within a state, each party natural only wants the general good. Therein consists indeed the bellum omnium contra omnes, the war of all against all, but that sovereignty, and thereby the state itself, consists in deciding this controversy, that is, in determining definitively was public order and security are, when they are disturbed, and so on. In concrete reality, public order and security present themselves very differently, depending on whether some militaristic bureaucracy, a self-governing body controlled by a commercial spirit, or radical party organization determines when there is order and security and when they are threatened or disturbed. After all, every state of order rests on a decision, and also the concept of legal order, which is thoughtlessly applied as something self-evident, contains within itself the contrast of the two different elements of the juristic. Even legal order, like every order, rests on a decision and not a norm. Whether only God is sovereign, that is, the one who acts in the earthly reality as his uncontested representative, or the emperor, or the prince, or the people are sovereign, that is, those who can uncontestably identify themselves with the people, the question is always aimed at the subject of sovereignty, that is, the application of the concept to a concrete situation. Since the 16th century, jurists who discuss the question of sovereignty take as a starting point a catalogue of sovereign capacities that assembles a range of decisive features of sovereignty, and in essence traces back to Bowdoin's oft-cited discussion. To be sovereign means to have these capacities. In the vague legal relationships of the old German Reich, the constitutional argumentation went that since one of the various features of sovereignty was undoubtedly present, the other, dubious features must also be present. The controversy always revolved around to whom authority should fall in a situation for which there were no positive provisions, perhaps a capitulation for example, in other words, who should be responsible for the case for which no responsibility has been anticipated? Put more familiarly, it was asked, who is supposed to have unlimited power for himself? Hence the discussion on the state of exception, the extremis necessitatis causis, case of extreme necessity. In the discussion on the so-called monarchical principle, this is repeated with the same legally logical structure. Here too it is always asked who decides on the capacities not outlined in the Constitution, that is, who is responsible to act when the legal system gives no answer regarding jurisdiction. During the controversy as to whether the individual German states were sovereign after the Constitution of 1871, the debate concerned an issue of far more minor political significance. Even so, the same pattern of argumentation can be recognized. The crucial point of Max Seidel's attempt to prove that the individual states were sovereign is not so much the concept of the derivability or non-derivability of the rights remaining to the individual states, but rather the claim that the jurisdiction of the Reich was circumscribed by the Constitution, that is, fundamentally limited, while the jurisdiction of the individual states was fundamentally unlimited. According to Article 48 of the German Constitution of 1919, a state of exception is declared by the President of the Reich but is under control of the Reichstag, which can at any time demand its suspension. This regulation corresponds to the development and practice of the constitutional state, which, through a division of powers and mutual control, attempts to postpone the question of sovereignty as much as possible. Yet only the regulation of conditions for emergency powers corresponds to the liberal constitutional tendency, not the content of Article 48, which rather lends unlimited powers, and therefore if applied without controls it would lend sovereignty in the same way as the emergency powers Article 14 of the French Charter of 1815, which grant to the monarch complete sovereignty. If the individual states have no more independent jurisdiction to declare a state of exception according to the prevailing interpretation of Article 48, then they are not states at all. In Article 48 lies the true crux of the question as to whether the German states remain independent states or not. If the emergency powers granted in a state of exception could be successfully circumscribed, be it through mutual control, through term limits, or, as in the constitutional states, regulation of what constitutes a state of siege, through enumeration of extraordinary powers, the question of sovereignty would be put aside to a large degree, but of course not eliminated. A jurisprudence oriented towards questions of day-to-day life and ordinary business has practically no interest in the concept of sovereignty. For such a jurisprudence, only the normal is recognizable, and everything else is a disturbance. Such a jurisprudence is bewildered when facing an extreme case, for not all extraordinary actions, not every police emergency measure or emergency decree is a true state of exception. Fundamentally unlimited authority appertains to this much more, meaning the suspension of the entire existing order. If this situation occurs, it becomes clear that the state persists while the law recedes. Because the state of exception is something entirely different from anarchy and chaos, order still exists in the juristic sense, even if the normal legal order does not. The existence of the state here proves that it supersedes the validity of the legal norm. The decision frees itself from any normative confines and becomes in the true sense absolute. In the state of exception, the state suspends law by virtue of its right to self-preservation, so to speak. The two elements of the concept of legal order come face to face and prove their conceptual independence. Whereas in the normal case the individual moment of decision can be kept to a minimum, in the state of exception the norm will be negated. Despite this, the state of exception remains accessible to jurisprudence because both elements, the norm and the decision, remain within the framework of the juristic. It would be a gross distortion of the schematic disjunction between sociology and legal theory if one were to say the exception had no juristic significance and was thus sociology. The exception is the unsubsumable, it eludes general codification, yet simultaneously manifests a specifically juristic element, the decision in absolute purity. The case of exception appears in its absolute form when a situation in which legal propositions can be valid must first be brought about. Every general norm requires a normal organization of living conditions to which it can be applied according to the facts of the situation, and which is subject to its regulations. The norm requires a homogeneous medium. This factual normalcy is not merely a superficial presupposition that a jurist can ignore, rather, it pertains to its immanent validity. There is no norm that would be applicable to chaos. Order must be established so that a legal order makes sense. A normal situation must be achieved, and he is sovereign who decides whether this situation actually exists. All law is situational law. The sovereign manages and guarantees this situation as a whole in its totality. He has the monopoly of this final decision. Therein lies the essence of state sovereignty, which is to be juristically defined not as a coercive or command monopoly, but rather as a monopoly on decision, where the word decision is employed in the broader, general sense. The case of exception most clearly reveals the essence of state authority. Here the decision departs from the legal norm, and, to formulate it paradoxically, the authority proves that in it does not need the law in order to create the law. The state of exception was incommensurable to the liberal constitutional doctrine of John Locke and the rationalist 18th century. The vivid consciousness of the significance of the exceptional case that prevailed in the natural law of the 17th century was soon lost again in the 18th century as a relatively long-lasting order was established. For Kant, emergency law was no longer law at all. The contemporary theory of state shows the interesting spectacle of both tendencies confronting each other, the rationalist tendency of ignoring the emergency, and interest in the case of emergency stemming from fundamentally opposing ideas. That a neo-Kantian like Kelsen systematically has no idea how to deal with the state of exception is self-evident. But it would have to be of interest even to the rationalist that a legal order itself could foresee the state of emergency and suspend itself. That a norm or an order or a point of imputation can establish itself seems to this type of juristic rationalist to be a particularly easily enforceable proposition. But how a systematic unity and order can suspend itself in a concrete case is difficult to comprehend, and yet is a juristic problem as long as the state of exception is differentiated from juristic chaos and from arbitrary anarchy. The liberal constitutional tendency to regulate the state of exception as thoroughly as possible simply indicates an attempt to precisely circumscribe the case in which the law suspends itself. From where does the law draw this power, and how is it logically possible that a norm is valid with the exception of one concrete case, which it cannot completely define? It would be a consequence of rationalism to say that the exception proves nothing and only the normal can be a subject of scholarly interest. The exception confounds the unity and order of the rationalist's theme. In the positive theory of state, one frequently encounters a similar argument. To the question of how to proceed without an available budget law, Gerhard Anschutz responds that this is not a question of law at all. There is here not so much a gap in the law, meaning in the text of the Constitution, as a gap in law as a whole, which cannot be filled by any juristic conceptual operations. Constitutional law ends here, Lehrbuch des deutschen Staatsrechts, page 906. It is precisely a philosophy of concrete life that cannot retreat from the exception in the extreme case, but must rather be interested in it to the highest degree. The exception can be more important than the rule, not only from a romantic irony for the paradox, but rather with the full earnestness of an insight that goes deeper than the clear generalization drawn from that which ordinarily repeats itself. The exception is more interesting than the normal case. The normal proves nothing, the exception proves everything. It not only confirms the rule only exists because of the exception. In the exception, the power of real life breaks through the crust of a mechanism grown sclerotic through repetition. A Protestant theologian, who has proven what vital intensity theological reflection is capable of even in the 19th century, said, "The exception explains the general in itself." And if one wishes to properly study the general, one need only look around for a true exception. It reveals everything more clearly than the general itself. In the long run, one becomes weary of eternal chatter about the general. There are exceptions. If one cannot explain it, then one can also not explain the general. Usually one does not notice the difficulty, because one does not think about the general with passion, but with a comfortable superficiality. The exception, on the other hand, thinks of the general with energetic passion. Søren Kierkegaard. 2. The problem of sovereignty is a problem of the legal form and the decision. When theories and concepts of constitutional law are reshaped under the influence of political events and changes, the discussion comes under the control of the practical viewpoints of the day and modifies the traditional conceptions according to some obvious purpose. New actualities can elicit a new sociological interest and a reaction against the formalistic approach to problems of constitutional law. It is, however, possible for an endeavor to emerge that makes juristic treatment independent from the change in political relations, and consequently achieves scholarly objectivity by a formal method of treatment. Thus, various scholarly tendencies and currents can emerge from the same political situation. Of all juristic concepts, the concept of sovereignty is most governed by contemporary interests. One customarily allows that its history begins with Bodin, but one cannot say that it has experienced a logical development or elucidation since the 16th century. The stages of its dogmatic history are marked by various political power struggles, not by a dialectical heightening from its conception. Bodin's concept of sovereignty appeared in the 16th century from the final dissolution of Europe into nation-states, and from the struggle of the absolute rule with the estates. In the 18th century, the self-consciousness of the newly established states was reflected in Emer de Vattel's concept of sovereignty in international law. In the newly founded German Reich, it became necessary after 1871 to advance a principle for the demarcation of the authority of the member states from that of the federal state, and from this concern arose a distinction in the German theory of state between the concept of sovereignty and the concept of state, with the help of which the individual states can retain their status as states, without their sovereignty being adjudicated. The old definition, in all kinds of variations, is always repeated: sovereignty is the highest, legally independent, underived power. Such a definition can be applied to all kinds of political sociological complexes and employed in the service of all kinds of political interests. It is not the adequate expression of a reality, but rather a formula, a sign, a signal. It is endlessly ambiguous and thus in practice extraordinarily useful or entirely worthless depending on the situation. It employs the superlative highest power as a designation of an actual quantity, although in reality governed by the law of causality. No single factor can be singled out and regarded with such a superlative. An irresistible highest or greatest power functioning according to the certainty of natural law does not exist in political reality. Power proves nothing for the law for the banal reason that Jean-Jacques Rousseau formulated in agreement with his time thusly: La force est une puissance physique, le pistolet que le brigand est aussi une puissance. Force is a physical power, the pistol carried by the brigand is also a form of power. The Social Contract, Book 1, Chapter 3. The connection of factual and legal highest power is the fundamental problem of the concept of sovereignty. Herein lie all the difficulties, and the issue is finding a definition that captures this fundamental concept of jurisprudence not through general tautological predicates, but through specification of its juristic essence. The most thorough treatment of the concept of sovereignty in recent years attempts a simple solution nevertheless: sociological jurisprudence, and with a simple either or, obtaining something purely sociological or something purely juristic. Kelsen followed this path in his works Das Problem der Souveränität und die Theorie des Völkerrechts, The Problem of Sovereignty and the Theory of International Law, Tübingen 1920, and Der Soziologische und der juristische Staatsbegriff, The Sociological and the Legal Concept of State, Tübingen 1922. All sociological elements are left out of the juristic concept so that a system of attribution to norms and to a final uniform base norm can be achieved in unadulterated purity. The old contrast between is and ought, between causal and normative considerations, is transferred to the contrast of sociology and jurisprudence, with greater insistence and rigor than had already been done by Georg Jelinek and Kosciuszko, but with the same unproven implicitness. It seems to be the fate of juristic scholarship that such disjunctions are applied to it from some other scholarly discipline or from epistemology. Kelsen, using this procedure, arrived at the unsurprising conclusion that for juristic consideration, the state must be something purely juristic, something normatively valid, not just some reality or concept beside, alongside and outside of the legal order, but rather nothing other than this legal order itself, conceived of as a unity. That this is precisely where the problem lies does not seem to create any difficulties. Thus, the state is neither the originator nor the source of the legal order. All such perceptions, according to Kelsen, are personifications and hypostatization, duplications of the uniform and identical legal order in different subjects. The state, that is, the legal order, is a system of attributions to a final point of attribution and a final base norm. The hierarchical order that is valid in the state rests on the premise that authorizations and competences emanate from the uniform central point to the lowest point. The highest competence comes not from a person or a socio-psychological power complex, but from the sovereign order itself in the unity of the system of norms. For juristic consideration there are neither real nor fictitious persons, but rather only points of attribution. The state is the endpoint of attributions, to which attributions, which are the essence of juristic consideration, can come to a stop. This point is simultaneously an order that cannot be further derived. A continuous system of orders emanating from the original, final, highest, to a lower, meaning a delegated norm, can be thought of in such a manner. The decisive argument, constantly repeated and brought against every scholarly opponent, remains the same: the basis for the validity of a norm can only be a norm. For juristic considerations, the state is therefore identical with its constitution, meaning with the uniform base norm. The watchword of this deduction is unity. The unity of the epistemological viewpoint imperiously demands a monistic view. The dualism of the methods of sociology and jurisprudence ends in a monistic metaphysics. The unity of the legal order, meaning the state, however, remains pure and free of everything sociological within the framework of the juristic. Is this juristic unity of the same kind as the worldwide unity of the entire system? How is it that a host of positive provisions can be traced to a unity with the same point of attribution, when what is meant is not the unity of a system of natural law, nor a general theoretical legal theory, but rather the unity of a positively valid order? Words like order, system, and unity are indeed only circumscriptions of the same postulation, which must demonstrate how it can be fulfilled in its purity. It must be shown how a system can arise on the basis of a constitution, which means either a further tautological circumscription of the unity or a brutal socio-political fact. According to Kelsen, systematic unity is an independent act of juristic perception. Let us disregard the interesting mathematical mythology according to which a point should be an order, and a system, and identical with a norm, and let us ask on what the intellectual necessity and objectivity of the various attributions to the various points of attribution, if not on a positive proposition, that is, a command. The continuous unity and order is constantly discussed as though it were the most self-evident matter in the world, as though there existed a pre-established harmony between the result of a free juristic knowledge and the complex that only constitutes a unity in political reality. A stepladder of higher and lower orders is spoken of, supposedly found in every positive ordinance trotted out before jurisprudence. The normative scholarship to which Kelsen wishes to raise jurisprudence in total purity cannot be normative in the sense that the jurist judges from his own free will. He can only draw from given, positively given, values. Objectivity thus appears to be possible but has no necessary connection to positivity. The values the jurist draws are indeed given to him, but he acts with relativistic superiority in the face of them. For he can construct a unity from everything in which he is juristically interested, provided that he remains pure. Unity and purity are, however, easily achieved when one ignores actual difficulties with great insistence and, for formal reasons, everything which contradicts the system is excluded as impure. He who takes no chances and stays resolutely methodological, without a single concrete example to point to in which his jurisprudence differs from that which was previously taken as jurisprudence, finds it easy to be critical. The methodological invocation, conceptual sharpening, and astute criticism are only valuable as preparation. If they do not get to the point, with the rationale that jurisprudence is something formal, then they remain, despite all effort, in the antechamber of jurisprudence. Kelsen solves the problem of the concept of sovereignty by negating it. The result of his deduction is that the concept of sovereignty must be radically repressed. Das Problem der Souveränität, page 320. This is the old liberal negation of the state as opposed to the law, and ignoring the independent problem of implementing the law. This perception is presented in Hugo Krabbe, whose theory of legal sovereignty, under the title Die moderne Staatsidee, The Modern Idea of the State, 1906, expanded edition 1919, rests on the thesis that it is not the state but rather the law that is sovereign. Kelsen seems to see here a mere precursor to his own theory of the identity of state and legal order. In reality, Krabbe's theory has a common ideological root with Kelsen's result, but precisely where Kelsen was original in his methodology, there is no connection between the Dutch jurist and the epistemological and methodological distinctions of the German neo-Kantian. As Krabbe says, however one wants to take it, the theory of legal sovereignty is either the description of an actually extant state of affairs, or a postulation whose implementation should be striven for. Page 39. The modern idea of state, according to Krabbe, replaces personal force, of the king, of the authorities, with spiritual power. We no longer live under the authority of persons, be they natural or artificial, legal, persons, but under the authority of norms, of spiritual forces. There the essence of the modern idea of the state is revealed. He continues, these forces rule in the strictest sense of the word, for, because they originate from the spiritual nature of man, these forces can achieve voluntary obedience. The basis, the source of the legal order, is to be found only in the members of the nation's feeling and consciousness of justice. There is nothing more to be said about this basis, it is the only one that is realistic. Although Krabbe says he does not deal with sociological investigations into the forms of rule, he makes essentially sociological explanations about the organizational formation of the modern state, in which the professional civil service, as an officially independent authority, identifies with the state, and the civil service, as something specifically pertaining to public law, is set apart from the usual service. The contrast of public and private law, insofar as it rests on a difference in the reality of the subjects, is radically denied. Page 138. The further development of the decentralization and autonomy in all areas is supposed to allow the modern idea of the state to emerge ever more distinctly. Not the state, but the law is supposed to have power. The old, constantly repeated view that power is the feature of the state, and the definition of the state as a manifestation of power can be permitted, with one condition, that with regard to this power it is recognized that it reveals itself in the law and can in no other way assert itself than through issuing a legal norm. Yet it must simultaneously be remembered that it is exclusively in the creation of law, be it through passing new laws or rewriting old laws, that the state reveals itself, not through the application of laws or exercise of any public interest. Page 255. The only task of the state is to generate law, that is, the assessment of the legal value of interests. Page 261. It is not from the domination of any interests, but rather exclusively from the original source of the law that all such interests and all other interests obtain their legal value. Page 260. The state is limited exclusively to production of law. That does not mean, however, that it produces the content of law. It does nothing but assess the legal value of interests according to the moral sense of the members of the nation. Therein lies a double limitation, first the one on the law, in contrast to interests or welfare, what is known in Kantian legal theory as matter, second on the declaratory, by no means constitutive active assessment. That it is precisely in this assessment that the problem of law as a substantive form lies will become apparent shortly. It must be observed that for Krabbe, the contrast of law and interests is not the contrast of form and matter. When he says that all public interests are subject to the law, it means that in the modern state, the legal interest is the highest interest, legal value the highest value. A general opposition to the centralized authoritarian state brings Krabbe close to cooperative theory. His struggle against the authoritarian state and its jurists recalls the famous writings of Hugo Prus. Otto von Guercke himself, the founder of cooperative theory, formulated his concept of state as follows: the will of the state or the sovereign is not the final source of the law, but rather the appointed organ of the people to express the legal consciousness that emerges from the life of the people. Die Grundbegriff des Staatsrechts und die Grundbegriff der neuen Staatsrechtstheorie, the fundamental concepts of state law and the newest theories of state law, Part 1. Page 179. The personal will of the sovereign is integrated into the state as an organic whole. Yet law and state are for Guercke equal powers, and to the basic question of their relation to each other he answered that both are two independent factors of human communal life, the one unthinkable without the other, but neither one existing because of or before the other. In the case of revolutionary constitutional changes there is a breach of law, a breach in legal continuity that can be ethically necessary or historically justified, but it remains a breach of law. Yet it can be repaired and subsequently receive legal justification through some legal procedure to satisfy the legal consciousness of the people, for example a constitutional arrangement, a referendum, or the sanctifying power of habit. Law and power tend to find each other, and thus the state of tension is eliminated. The equal power of the state is nevertheless obscured, as according to Gurke the state's lawmaking is only the final formal seal which the state stamps on the law, a stately imprint that only has superficial formal value, and so is only what Krabbe calls a mere assessment of legal value, which does, however, not belong to the essence of the law. Because of this, according to Gurke, international law can be law without being state law. If the state is pushed in this way into the role of a mere declaring herald, then it can no longer be sovereign. With the arguments of cooperative theory, Proust is able to dismiss the concept of sovereignty as a holdover of the authoritarian state, and find in the cooperative community built from the bottom up an organization that does not need a monopoly on authority, and therefore manages to get by without sovereignty at all. Among the newer representatives of the cooperative theory, Kurt Wohlsendorf attempts to solve the problem of a new epoch of state. Of his numerous works, Deutsche Völkerrechtsdenken Unken 1919, Die Lüge des Völkerrechts, Leipzig 1919, his last, Der Rechtsstaat, 1920, is of the greatest interest here. Its starting point is that the state needs the law and the law needs the state, but the law, as the deeper principle, holds the state in check in the end. The state is originally the power of the ruler, but it is so as the power of the order, as the form of the life of the people, not as an arbitrary coercion through some authority. It is demanded of this power that it intervene only when free individual or cooperative action is insufficient, otherwise, it should remain in the background as ultima ratio. That which is subject to order cannot be connected with economic, social, or cultural interests, because these must be left to self-government. That a certain maturity is a characteristic of self-government could be dangerous to Wohlsendorf's postulates, for in historical reality such historical pedagogical problems often take an unexpected turn from discussion to dictatorship. Wohlsendorf's pure state is one which limits itself to the function of maintaining order. The formation of law is also an aspect of this, because all law is simultaneously a problem of the existence of the state order. The state should preserve the law, it is custodian, not a commander, but even as a custodian it is not merely a blind servant, but rather the one responsible and the ultimate guarantor. In the idea of councils, Wohlsendorf sees an expression of this tendency towards cooperative self-government, towards limiting the state to its pure function. I do not believe that Wohlsendorf recognized how close he came with his ultimate guarantor to an authoritarian theory of state that is one of the most extremely opposed to the cooperative and democratic conception of state. Compared to Krabbe and the designated representatives of the cooperative theory, Wohlsendorf's final work is therefore especially important. It brings the discussion to the decisive concept of the form in its substantive sense. The power of order is so highly valued, and the function of guarantor is so independent, that the state no longer serves to simply assess the idea of the law or guide its direction in a superficially formal manner. The problem arises to the extent to which, with legally logical necessity, every assessment and decision contains a constitutive element, an intrinsic value of the form. Wohlsendorf speaks of the form as a socio-psychological phenomenon, an operative factor of historical political life, whose significance consists in giving opposing political forces the ability to grasp, in the conceptual structure of a state's constitution, a firm element of constructional calculation. The state thus also becomes a form in the sense of a way of life. Wohlsendorf does not distinctly differentiate between a form that serves a calculable function, and a form in the aesthetic sense, as the word is used, for example, by Hermann Haefele. The confusion spreading in philosophy about the concept of the form is repeated especially inauspiciously in sociology and jurisprudence. Legal form, technical form, aesthetic form, and finally the form concept of transcendental philosophy designates essentially different things. In the legal sociology of Max Weber one can distinguish three concepts of the form. First is the conceptual clarification of the legal content whose legal form, normative regulation, as he calls it, but only as the causal component of consensual acts. Then, where he speaks of the differentiation in the subject areas, the word formal is synonymous with rationalized, professionally trained, and finally, calculable. He says that a formally developed law is a complex of conscious maxims of decision, and that the contribution of those trained in the law, official providers of legal services, and so on, pertains to it sociologically. Professional training, that is rational training, becomes necessary with the increasing necessity of intercommunication, from which is derived the modern rationalization of the law towards the specifically juristic and the development of formal qualities, reached Sociology 2, page 1. Form can thus mean, firstly, the transcendental condition of juristic cognition, secondly, a consistent regularity derived from repeated practice and professional reasoning. Because of its consistency and calculability, this regularity leads into the third, Rationalistic form, meaning technical refinement arising from the necessities of intercommunication or from a juristically educated bureaucracy, oriented toward calculability, and governed by the ideal of frictionless functionality. We do not need to go into the neo-Kantian concept of the form here. What the technical form means is a clarification governed by a goal-oriented aspect and indeed applied to the organized state apparatus, but which does not reach the judicial form. The military order in its precision fulfills a technical ideal, not a legal ideal. That it can be aesthetically evaluated, and is perhaps even ceremonially accessible, does nothing to change its technicity. The ancient Aristotelian juxtaposition of deliberation and action begins with two different forms. Deliberation is approachable through legal form, action only through a technical form. The legal form is governed by the legal idea and the necessity of applying legal thought to a concrete situation, that is, implementation of the law in the broadest sense. Because a legal idea cannot implement itself, for any implementation into reality it needs a particular configuration and form. This applies to the formation of general legal thought into a positive law as well as to the application of a general legal norm in administering the law. A discussion of the peculiarity of the legal form must begin here. What does it mean when today in the theory of state, neo-Kantian formalism has been thrown aside, while simultaneously, but from an entirely different direction, a form is postulated? Is that one of those eternal mix-ups that make the history of philosophy so monotonous? One thing is certain to be recognized in this endeavor of the modern theory of state: the form should be transferred from the subjective to the objective. The concept of the form in Emile Lasque's doctrine of categories is still subjective, as pertains to every epistemologically critical mindset. Kelsen contradicts himself when, on the one hand, he takes up such critically derived subjectivist concept of form as a starting point, and conceives of the unity of the legal order as an independent act of juristic perception, yet on the other hand where he professes his worldview, demands objectivity, and accuses even Hegelian collectivism of subjectivism of the state. The objectivity he claims for himself amounts to nothing more than avoiding everything personalistic and tracing the legal order back to the impersonal validity of an impersonal norm. The various theories of the concept of sovereignty, Krabbe, Proust, Kelsen, are all in agreement in demanding such objectivity that everything personal must be eliminated from the concept of the state. For them, personality and command belong together. According to Kelsen, the notion of the personal right to command is the intrinsic error of the theory of state sovereignty. He calls the theory of the primacy of stately legal order subjectivist and a negation of the idea of law, because the subjectivity of the command replaces the objectively valid norm. Krabbe links the contrast of personal and impersonal with that of the concrete and the general, the individual and the universal, and one can extend the juxtaposition to that of the influence of power and the legal proposition, of authority and quality, and, in his general philosophy, of person and idea. It is in accordance with the tradition of the liberal constitutional state to juxtapose in this way personal command with the objective validity of an abstract norm. In the legal philosophy of the 19th century, Heinrich Arends, for example, made this particularly clear and interesting. For Proust and Krabbe, all ideas of personality are historical after-effects of absolute monarchy. All these objections fail to recognize that the concept of personality and its connection with formal authority arose from a specifically legal interest, namely a particularly clear awareness of what constitutes the essence of legal decision. Such a decision in the broadest sense pertains to every legal perception, for every legal thought transmits a legal idea, which in its purity never becomes reality, into another aggregate condition, adding an element which cannot be derived either from the content of the legal idea or from the content of any general positive legal norm when it is applied. Every concrete legal decision contains an element of indifference regarding content, because the legal conclusion cannot be traced to the last detail back to its premises, and the fact that a decision is necessary remains an independent determining element. This does not concern the causal and psychological origin of such a decision, although the abstract decision as such is also relevant here, but rather the determination of legal value. Sociologically, the interest in the certainty of the decision is particularly evident in the age of intensive commerce, because in numerous cases transport is less interested in a certain content than in a calculable certainty. I am often less interested in how the timetable determines the departure or arrival time in each individual case than in whether it functions reliably, so that I can accommodate myself accordingly. In legal communication, the so-called formal strictness of exchange and exchange law provides an example of such an interest. This type of calculability should not be confused with the legal interest in the decision as such. It is rooted in the nature of the normative and results from the fact that a concrete fact must be assessed concretely, even though the only standard of assessment is a legal principle in its general applicability, thus a transformation takes place every time. The fact that a legal idea cannot implement itself independently is evident from the fact that it says nothing about who should apply it. In every transformation is an auctoritatis interpositio, an interposition of authority. A differentiating determination as to which individual person or which concrete instance can claim such authority for itself cannot be derived from the mere legal quality of a proclamation. This is the difficulty that Krabbe consistently ignores. The fact that it is the competent body that renders a decision makes the decision relative, and under some circumstances absolute, regardless of the accuracy of its content, and cuts off further discussion of whether doubts may still exist. The decision instantly becomes independent of argumentative reasoning and acquires an independent value. In the theory of the faulty active state, this is revealed in its full theoretical and practical meaning. The incorrect and faulty decision has legal consequences. The incorrect decision contains a constitutive element, precisely because of its incorrectness. But it is inherent to the idea of the decision that there can be no absolute declaratory decisions at all. From the perspective of the content of the underlying norm, that constitutive, specific moment of decision is something new and foreign. The decision is, normatively speaking, born out of nothingness. The legal force of the decision is different from the result of reasoning. It is not attributed by means of a norm, but vice versa. Only from a point of attribution is it determined what a norm is and what normative correctness is. From the norm there is no point of attribution, but only a quality of a content. The formal in the specifically legal sense is in contrast to this quality of content, not to the quantitative content of a causal connection, for the fact that this last contrast is out of the question for jurisprudence should actually go without saying. The specific nature of the legal form must be recognized in its purely legal nature. The philosophical significance of the legal force of a decision or the immovable eternity of law, untouched by time and space, which Adolf Merkel, Arch. D. Pfeffenel. Rechts, 1917, page 19, spoke of should not be speculated on here. When he says that a development of the legal form is impossible, because it dissolves identity, he betrays that a roughly quantitative understanding of form is basically effective for him. From this kind of form, however, it is inexplicable how a personalistic element can enter into the doctrine of law and state. It corresponds to the age-old constitutional tradition, which has always assumed that only a general legal provision can be authoritative. The law gives authority, says Locke, and he employs the word law here in deliberate antithesis to commitio, meaning the personal command of the monarch. But he does not see that the law does not say to whom it gives authority. It cannot be just anybody that can enforce and realize any legal proposition. The legal principle as a decision-making norm states only how a decision is to be made, but not who is to decide. Anyone could invoke the correctness of the content if there were no last authority. However, the last authority does not result from the decision-making norm. Accordingly, the question is that of competence, a question which cannot even be raised from the substantive legal quality of a proposition, much less answered. To answer questions of competence by referring to the material is to make a fool of oneself. There are perhaps two types of thought in legal scholarship which can be determined according to the extent to which a scientific awareness of the normative nature of the legal decision exists or not. The classic representative of the decisionist type, if I may coin this word, is Hobbes. The fact that this type, and not the other type, developed the classical formulation of the antithesis is also explained by the peculiarity of this type, auctoritas, non veritas facit legem, Leviathan, chapter 26. The antithesis of auctoritas and veritas is more radical and precise than Friedrich Julius Stahl's contrast, authority, not majority. Hobbes also puts forward a decisive argument which contains the connection between this decisionism and personalism, and rejects all attempts to replace concrete state sovereignty with an abstractly valid order. He discusses the demand that state authority must be subject to spiritual authority, because spiritual authority is a higher order. To this reasoning he replies, if one power, potestas, were to be subject to the other, it would only mean that the one who has the power should be subject to the one who has the other power, he which hath the one power is subject to him that hath the other. The fact that one speaks of superiority and subordination and at the same time attempts to remain abstract is incomprehensible to him, we cannot understand. For subjection, command, right, and power are accidents, not of powers but of persons, chapter 42. He illustrates this by one of those comparisons which he knows how to make so strikingly in the unflinching sobriety of his sound common sense. One force or order can be subject to another, just as the art of the saddler is subject to that of the rider, but the essential thing is that, in spite of these abstract stages of order, no one thinks of subordinating the individual saddler to each individual rider and obliging him to obey. It is striking that one of the most consistent representatives of the abstract natural science of the 17th century becomes so personalistic. But it can be explained by the fact that as a legal thinker he wants to grasp the effective reality of social life just as much as he, as a philosopher and natural scientist, wants to grasp the reality of nature. He did not recognize that there is a juristic reality and liveliness that need not be the reality in the sense of the natural sciences. Even mathematical relativism and nominalism are compatible. He often seems to be able to construct the unity of the state from any given point. But at that time legal thinking was not yet so overpowered by the natural sciences that he, in the intensity of his scientific approach, could have unsuspectingly overlooked the specific reality of legal life that lay in the legal form. The form he seeks lies in the concrete decision which emanates from a particular authority. With the independent meaning of the decision, the subject of the decision has an independent meaning besides its content. The reality of legal life depends on who decides. Besides the question of the correctness of the content, there is the question of jurisdiction. The problem of the juristic form lies in the contrast between the subject and the content of the decision, and in the proper meaning of the subject. It does not have the a priori emptiness of the transcendental form, because it arises precisely from the juristically concrete. Nor is it the form of technical precision, for this has an essentially factual, impersonal, goal-oriented interest. Nor, finally, is it the form of aesthetic design that knows no decision. 3. Political theology. All significant concepts of the modern theory of state are secularized theological concepts, not only according to their historical development, because they were transferred from theology to the theory of state, whereby, for example, the omnipotent lawmaker becomes the Almighty God, but also in their systematic structure, the recognition of which is necessary for a sociological consideration of these terms. For jurisprudence, the state of emergency has an analogous significance as the miracle has for theology. Only with the awareness of such an analogous position can the development which the ideas of the philosophy of state have taken in the last centuries be recognized. The idea of the modern constitutional state prevailed along with deism, a theology and metaphysics that banishes the miracle from the world, and rejects the transgression of the laws of nature contained in the concept of the miracle, an exception brought about through a direct intervention, just as it rejects the direct intervention of the sovereign in a valid legal order. The rationalism of the Enlightenment rejected the exception in every form. The theistic conviction of the conservative writers of the counter-revolution could therefore attempt to support the personal sovereignty of the monarch ideologically with analogies from a theistic theology. I have long pointed out the fundamental systematic and methodological importance of such analogies. Der Wert des Staates, Tübingen 1914, Politische Romantik, Munich, and Leipzig, 1919, Klassenkampf, Munich, and Leipzig, 1921. A detailed explanation of the meaning of the concept of the miracle in this context must be left for another time. What is of interest here is the extent to which this connection can be considered for a sociology of juristic concepts. The most interesting political application of such analogies can be found in the Catholic philosophers of state of the counter-revolution, in Bonald, de Maistre, and Donoso Cortés. Even at first glance, it is clear that theirs is a conceptually clear, systematic analogy, and not some mystical, natural philosophical or even romantic gimmickry, which, as for everything else, naturally finds colorful symbols and images for state and society. The clearest philosophical expression of this analogy is found in Leibniz's Nova Methodus, paragraphs 4, 5. He rejects the comparison of jurisprudence with medicine and mathematics in order to emphasize the systematic relationship with theology. Merito partitionis nostri exemplum a theologia ad jurisprudentium transculamus, quia mira est utriasque facultatis similitudo. We have deservedly transferred the model of our division from theology to jurisprudence because the similarity of these two disciplines is astonishing. Both have a duplex principium, the ratio, reason, hence there is a natural theology and a natural jurisprudence, and the scriptura, scripture, that is, a book of positive revelations and orders. Adolf Menzel noted in an essay entitled Natural Law and Sociology, Vienna and Leipzig, 1912, that today sociology has taken over functions that natural law exercised in the 17th and 18th centuries, namely to express demands for justice, and historical philosophical constructions or ideals. He seems to believe that sociology is therefore inferior to jurisprudence, which is supposed to have become positive, and seeks to show that all previous sociological systems end up providing political tendencies with the appearance of a scientific rigor. But whoever takes the trouble to examine the constitutional literature of positive jurisprudence down to the last concepts and arguments will see that the state intervenes at all points. Sometimes it does so as a deus ex machina by way of positive jurisprudence, deciding a controversy which the independent act of legal knowledge could not lead to a generally plausible solution. Other times it does so as the good and merciful one, who, through pardons and amnesties, proves his supremacy over his own laws. Always there is the same inexplicable identity, as lawmaker, as executive, as police, as grantor of clemency, as welfare service, so that to a viewer who takes the trouble to let the overall picture of contemporary jurisprudence take effect from a certain distance, a large cloak and dagger drama appears, in which the state acts under many disguises, but always as the same invisible person. The omnipotence of the modern lawmaker, which one hears about in every textbook of constitutional law, is not only linguistically derived from theology. Theological reminiscences also appear in the details of the argumentation, mostly, of course, with polemical intent. In the positivist age, one likes to reproach one's scholarly opponent for pushing theology or metaphysics. If the reproach is to be more than mere insult, at least the question could have been obvious where the inclination to such theological and metaphysical derailments actually comes from. One would have had to examine whether they can be explained historically, perhaps as an after-effect of the monarchist theory of state, which identified the theistic God with the king, or whether they are perhaps based on systematic or methodological necessities. I readily admit that there are jurists in whose work, out of an inability to intellectually manage contradictory arguments or objections, the state appears with a kind of short-circuit of thought, just as the name of God is misused for such purposes by certain metaphysicians. But this does not answer the factual question. So far, one has generally been content with casual hints. In his writing on the law in the formal and material sense, Das Gesetz im formellen und materiellen Sinne, Leipzig 1888 page 150, Albert Hahnel raised the old objection that it is metaphysics to demand the unification of all the functions of the state in a single organ for the sake of the necessary uniformity and regularity of the state's will, both of which he in no way disputes. Proust, in the Festgabe für la Bande, 1908, Volume 2, page 236, also tries to defend his cooperative concept of state by pushing his opponent into the theological and metaphysical. The concept of sovereignty in the theory of state of La Bande and Jelinek and the theory of the sole power of the state to rule turns the state into an abstract quasi-individual, an unicum sui generis, with its monopoly on power created by mystical production. According to Proust, this is a juristic disguise of the doctrine of the divine right of kings, the repetition of the teachings of Morin-Brecher with the modification that religious fiction is replaced by juristic fiction. Such a representative of the organic theory of state makes the objection to his opponent that he is theologizing. Conversely, Edmund Bernatzik, in his critical studies on the concept of the legal person, Archive des Offentlichen Rechts, Archive of Public Law v. 1890, pages 210, 225, 244, raises the objection precisely against the organic theory of state and seeks to dispense with an opinion of Stein, Schultz, Gurke and Proust with the sneering remark, if the organo of the entire personality were in turn to be persons, then every administrative authority, every court etc. would be a legal person and yet the state as a whole would again be a single such legal person. In comparison, an attempt to understand the dogma of the Trinity would be a trifle. Staub's opinion that the jointly owned entity is a legal person is also dismissed by saying that he does not understand such phrases which again remind us of the doctrine of the Trinity. Of course, he himself says, the very concept of legal capacity implies that its source, the state legal system, must establish itself as the subject of all law, i.e. as a juristic person. This self-establishment is apparently so simple and plausible to him that he mentions a dissenting opinion only as a curiosity without asking himself why it should be a more logical necessity for the source of legal capacity, the legal order, namely the state legal order, to posit itself as a product than when Stahl says that only one person can always be the cause of another person. Kelsen has the merit of having pointed out in his own manner the methodological relationship between theology and jurisprudence since 1920. In his last writing on the sociological and juristic concepts of the state he cites many admittedly diffuse analogies, which, however, indicate the inner heterogeneity of his epistemological starting point and his ideological, democratic result, allowing a deeper insight into the history of the ideas. His identification of state and legal order under the rule of law is based on a metaphysics that identifies the lawfulness of nature and normative lawfulness. It arises from an exclusively scientific way of thinking. It is based on the rejection of all arbitrariness and seeks to expel every exception from the realm of the human mind. In the history of that parallel of theology and jurisprudence, such a conviction probably finds its place most appropriately with John Stuart Mill. He too, in the interest of objectivity and for fear of arbitrariness, emphasized the validity without exception of every kind of law, but he probably did not assume, as did Kelsen, that the independent act of legal perception could shape the cosmos of its system from just any positive mass of law, for in this way objectivity is nullified again. Whether unconditional positivism adheres directly whatever law is thrown before it, or whether it first makes the effort to establish a system, should not justify any difference in the face of a metaphysics that suddenly falls into the pathos of objectivity. As soon as he goes one step beyond his methodological criticism, Kelsen operates with a concept of cause derived entirely from the natural sciences. This is best shown by the fact that he believes that Hume's and Kant's criticisms of the concept of substance can be transferred to the theory of state, Staatsbegriff, page 208, without seeing that the concept of substance in scholastic thought is something entirely different from that in mathematical and natural scientific thought. The distinction between the substance and the practice of law, which has a fundamental significance in the dogmatic history of the concept of sovereignty, I pointed this out in my book on dictatorship, pages 44, 105, 194, cannot be grasped at all with scientific terms, and yet it is an essential element of legal argumentation. In the justification Kelsen gives for his commitment to democracy, the constitutional, mathematical, scientific nature of his thinking is openly expressed. Democracy is the expression of a political relativism and a scientific approach free of miracles and dogma, based on the human mind and critical doubt. Vom Wesen und Wert der Demokratie, Institut für Sozialwissenschaft und Sozialpolitik 47, 1920-21, page 84. For the sociology of the concept of sovereignty, it is necessary to be clear about the sociology of legal concepts in general. That systematic analogy between theological and juristic concepts is emphasized here because a sociology of juristic concepts presupposes a consistent and developed ideology. It would be a serious misunderstanding to believe that this is a spiritual philosophy of history as opposed to a materialist one. The political theology of the Restoration period offers an excellent illustration of the point that Max Weber made in his critique of Rudolf Stammler's philosophy of law, namely that a radically materialist philosophy of history can be irrefutably contrasted with an equally radically spiritual philosophy of history. The counter-revolutionary writers explained the political changes from a change in worldview, and attributed the French Revolution to the philosophy of the Enlightenment. It was simply a clear antithesis when radical revolutionaries, conversely, attributed the change in thought to the change in political and social conditions. Already in the 1820s it was a common dogma in Western Europe, especially in France, that religious, philosophical, artistic, and literary changes were closely related to political and social conditions. In the Marxist philosophy of history, this connection is extended to the economic and systematically taken seriously, in that a point of attribution for political and social changes is also sought and found in the economic. This materialistic explanation makes an isolated consideration of ideological consequence impossible, because it sees everywhere only reflexes, reflections, disguises of economic relations, thus consequently working with psychological explanations, interpretations and, at least in its vulgar form, with suspicions. Precisely because of its grave rationalism, however, it can easily turn into an irrationalist view of history, because it conceives of all thought as a function and emanation of vital processes. The anarcho-syndicalist socialism of Georges Sorel thus knew to combine Henri Bergson's philosophy of life with Marx's economic view of history. The spiritualist explanation of material processes and the materialist explanation of spiritual phenomena both seek to establish causal connections. First, they establish an opposition between two spheres, and then, by reducing one to the other, they dissolve this opposition again into nothingness. This procedure turns into a caricature out of methodical necessity. Just as Engels regards the Calvinist dogma of predestination as a reflection of the senselessness and unpredictability of capitalist competition, modern relativity and its success can just as easily be reduced to the exchange rates of today's world market, and would then have found its economic foundation. There is a parlance that would call this the sociology of a concept or theory. That won't be taken into consideration here. The situation is different with the sociological method, which, for certain ideas and intellectual constructions, looks for the typical group of people who come to certain ideological results from their sociological situations. In this sense, it is a sociology of juristic concepts when Max Weber attributes the differentiation of substantive legal fields to the development of trained legal experts, civil servants in the administration of justice, or legal dignitaries, reach sociology. 2, section I. The sociological peculiarity of the group of persons who professionally deal with the formation of law necessitates certain methods and evidence of juristic argumentation. But even that is still not sociology of a juristic concept. To attribute a conceptual result to a sociological carrier is psychology, and determination of a certain type of motivation of human action. This is a sociological problem, but not that of the sociology of a concept. If this method is applied to intellectual achievements, it leads to explanations based on the milieu, or even to the witty psychology known as the sociology of specific types, the bureaucrat, the lawyer, the state-employed professor. This method could, for example, find in a sociology of the Hegelian system the fact that it is called the philosophy of the professional lecturer, who is enabled by his economic and social situation to become, with contemplative superiority, conscious of the absolute consciousness, meaning to practice his profession as a lecturer of philosophy. Or one could consider Kelson's jurisprudence as the ideology of the legal bureaucrat working in changing political conditions, who, under the most diverse forms of rule, with relativistic superiority over the current political power, seeks to systematically process the positive orders and regulations assigned to him. In its consequent manner, this is the kind of sociology that is best assigned to fine literature, a socio-psychological portrait, the procedure of which is indistinguishable from the literary spiritual criticism of Sainte-Beuve, for example. The sociology of concepts proposed here is something entirely different, as it alone has the prospect of a scientific result in the face of a concept like sovereignty. Going beyond the juristic conceptualizations oriented to the immediate practical interests of legal life, the final, fundamentally systematic structure is found, and this conceptual structure is compared with the conceptual processing of the social structure of a particular epoch. Whether the ideal of fundamental conceptualization here is the reflex of a sociological reality, or whether social reality is understood as the consequence of a certain way of thinking and consequently of acting, does not come into consideration. Rather, two spiritual but substantial identities must be proven. It is thus not sociology of the concept of sovereignty when, for example, the monarchy of the 17th century is described as the real that was reflected in the Cartesian concept of God. However, it is part of the sociology of the concept of sovereignty of that epoch to show that the historical political existence of the monarchy corresponded to the entire state of consciousness of Western European humanity at that time, and that the juristic shaping of historical political reality could find a concept whose structure corresponded to the structure of metaphysical concepts. In this way the monarchy became as self-evident for the consciousness of that time as democracy became for a later epoch. Presupposition of this kind of sociology of juristic concepts is therefore a fundamental conceptualization, i.e. a consequence that is extended up to the metaphysical and theological. The metaphysical image that a particular age makes of the world has the same structure as that which is readily apparent to that age as a form of its political organization. The establishment of such an identity is the sociology of the concept of sovereignty. It proves that indeed, as Edward Caird said in his book on Auguste Comte, metaphysics is the most intense and clear expression of an epoch. It proves that indeed, as Edward Caird said in his book on Auguste Comte, metaphysics is the most intense and clear expression of an epoch. Imiter les decrets immuables de la divinité, to imitate the immutable decrees of divinity, was the ideal of state legal life, which was readily apparent to the rationalism of the 18th century. This statement is found in Rousseau's essay Political Economy, in which the politicization of theological concepts is so conspicuous, especially in the concept of sovereignty, that it rarely escaped the attention of any real expert on his political writings. Émile Boutmy, Annales des Sciences Politiques 1902, page 418 says, Rousseau appliquait au souverain l'idée que les philosophes se font de Dieu, il peut tout ce qu'il veut, mais il ne peut vouloir le mal. Rousseau applies to the sovereign the idea that philosophers hold of God: he can do whatever he wills, but he cannot will evil. Frédéric Acker, Essai sur l'histoire des doctrines du contrat social, 1906, page 136, noticed that the monarch is identified with God in the state theory of the 17th century and has the exactly analogous position in the state that the God of the Cartesian system has in the world. Le prince développé toutes les virtualités de l'état par une sorte de création continuelle. Le prince est le dieu cartesian transposed dans le monde politique. The prince develops all the potentialities of the state through a kind of continuous creation. The prince is the Cartesian God transposed into the political world. The beautiful narrative of the Discours de la Méthode provides an extraordinarily instructive example for the fact that here, first of all psychologically, and for a phenomenologist also phenomenologically, a perfect identity passes through the metaphysical, political and sociological ideas and postulates the sovereign as a personal unit and final creator. It is a document of the new rationalist spirit, which in all doubts finds reassurance in the unwavering use of its intellect. J'étais assured d'user en tout de ma raison, I was assured to use my reason in everything. But what is the first thing that becomes clear to the mind suddenly concentrating on reflection? That the works created by several masters are not as perfect as the others on which a single one has worked. Un seul architecte, a sole architect, must build a house and a city. The best constitutions are the work of a single clever legislator, they are inventes par un sol, and finally, a single God rules the world. As Descartes once wrote to Mersenne, c'est Dieu qui a établi ses lois en nature ainsi qu'un roi établit les lois en son royaume. It is God who established these laws in nature, just as a king establishes the laws in his kingdom. The 17th and 18th centuries were dominated by this idea. This is, apart from the decisionist nature of his thinking, one of the reasons why Hobbes, despite his nominalism and scientific approach, despite his reduction of the individual to the atom, remains personalistic and postulates an ultimate concrete decisive instance, and also elevates his state, the Leviathan, to the status of a monstrous person, almost into mythology. For him this is not anthropomorphism, he was truly free of this, but a methodical and systematic necessity of his legal thinking. However, the image of the architect and world builder contains the ambiguity of the concept of causality. The world builder is at the same time creator and legislator, that is, the legitimizing authority. Throughout the Enlightenment up to the French Revolution, such a world and state architect was the legislator. Since that time, the consequence of exclusively scientific thinking has also penetrated political ideas and displaced the essentially legal ethical thinking that still prevailed in the Enlightenment. The general validity of a legal principle is identified with the natural law that applies without exception. The sovereign, who in the deistic worldview had remained, even if outside the world, as the assembler of the great machine, is radically repressed. The machine now runs by itself. The metaphysical proposition that God gives only general, not particular expressions of will dominates the metaphysics of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and Nicolas Malebranche. In Rousseau's writings, the volonté générale, general will, becomes identical with the will of the sovereign. At the same time, however, the concept of the general also acquires a quantitative definition in its subject, that is, the people become the sovereign. Thereby the decisionistic and personalistic element of the previous concept of sovereignty is lost. The will of the people is always good, le peuple est toujours vertueux, the people is always virtuous. De quelque manière qu'une nation voit, il suffit qu'elle voit, toutes les formes sont bonnes et sa volonté est toujours la loi suprême. No matter what a nation wants, it is enough that it wants, all forms are good and its will is always the supreme law, Emmanuel Cis. But the necessity by which the people always want the right thing was different from the rightness which characterized the orders of the personal sovereign. In the struggle of conflicting interests and coalitions, absolute monarchy had given the decision and thus established state unity. The unity that represents a people does not have this decisionist character, it is an organic unity, and with national consciousness arise the ideas of the organic whole of the state. Thus, the theistic as well as the deistic concept of God becomes incomprehensible for political metaphysics. Admittedly, the after effects of the idea of God remain recognizable for some time to come. In America this becomes the rationally pragmatic belief that the voice of the people is the voice of God, a belief that underlies Jefferson's victory of 1801. Tocqueville said in his description of American democracy that in democratic thinking the people hover like God over the whole of state life, as cause and end of all things, from which everything starts and to which everything returns. Today, on the other hand, an eminent philosopher of state like Kelsen can understand democracy as the expression of relativistic, impersonal scientism. This is indeed in accordance with the development that prevailed in the political theology and metaphysics of the 19th century. The transcendence of God towards the world pertains to the concept of God of the 17th and 18th century, just as the transcendence of the sovereign towards the state belongs to the philosophy of state of that time. In the 19th century, everything was dominated by ideas of immanence to an ever-increasing extent. All the identities that recur in the political and constitutional doctrine of the 19th century are based on such immanent conceptions: the democratic thesis of the identity of the rulers with the ruled, the organic theory of state and its identity of state and sovereignty, Krabbe's constitutional theory of state and its identity of sovereignty and legal order, and finally Kelsen's doctrine of the identity of the state with the legal order. After the writers of the Restoration had first developed a political theology, the ideological struggle of the radical opponents of all existing order was directed with increasing awareness against the belief in God in general as the most extreme fundamental expression of faith in domination and unity. Under the clear influence of Auguste Comte, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon took up the fight against God. Bakunin continued it with Scythian fury. The fight against traditional religiosity has of course very diverse political and sociological motives: the conservative attitude of ecclesiastical Christianity, the alliance of throne and altar, the fact that so many great writers were declassed, the emergence in the 19th century of an art and literature whose brilliant representatives were, at least in decisive periods of their lives, spat out by the bourgeois order. All this is still far from being recognized and appreciated in sociological detail. The great line of development is undoubtedly that among the mass of the educated, all notions of transcendence are lost and either a more or less clear immanence pantheism or a positivist indifference towards all metaphysics becomes evident to them. Insofar as immanence philosophy, which found its greatest systematic architecture in Hegel's philosophy, retains the concept of God, it incorporates God into the world and lets law and the state emerge from the immanence of the objective. Among the most extreme radicals, atheism consequently became dominant. The German left Hegelians were most aware of this connection. They did not proclaim any less decisively than Proudhon that mankind must take the place of God. Marx and Engels never misunderstood that this ideal of humanity becoming aware of itself had to end in an anarchist freedom. Precisely because of its youthful intuition, a quote from the young Engels from between 1842-44 is of the greatest significance here: "The essence of both state and religion is mankind's fear of itself." Schriften aus der Frühzeit, edited by G. Meyer, Berlin 1920, page 281. Seen from this kind of view of the history of ideas, the development of state theory in the 19th century shows two characteristic moments: the elimination of all theistic and transcendental ideas and the formation of a new concept of legitimacy. The traditional concept of legitimacy apparently loses all evidence. The traditional concept of legitimacy apparently loses all credibility. Neither the private law patrimonial version of the Restoration period nor a foundation on an emotional, reverent attachment was able to withstand this development. Since 1848, the doctrine of constitutional law has become positive and usually hides its embarrassment behind this word, or else, in various paraphrases, it bases all power on the pouvoir constituent power, of the people, i.e. the democratic idea of legitimacy replaces the monarchical idea. It is therefore an event of immeasurable significance that one of the greatest exponents of decisionist thought and a Catholic philosopher of state, Donoso Cortés, who was radically aware of the metaphysical core of all politics, came to the conclusion, in the wake of the Revolution of 1848, that the era of royalism was over. There is no more royalism because there are no more kings. There is therefore also no more legitimacy in the traditional sense. Accordingly, only one result remained for him: dictatorship. It is the conclusion to which Hobbes also came, from the same consequence of decisionist thinking, albeit mixed with a mathematical relativism. Autoritas, non veritas facit legem, authority, not truth, makes law. There is not yet a detailed account of this decisionism and an in-depth evaluation of Donoso Cortés. Here it can only be pointed out that the theological style of the Spaniard remains entirely in line with medieval thought, whose structure is juristic. All his perceptions, all his arguments are so juristic down to the last atom that he regards the mathematical natural scientific thought of the 19th century with the same lack of understanding with which this natural scientific thought regards decisionism and the specific conclusiveness of juristic thinking that culminates in a personal decision. 4. On the political philosophy of the counter-revolution, de Maistre, Bonald, Donoso Cortés. There is an original idea peculiar to the German Romantics, the eternal conversation. Novalis and Adam Muller partook in it as the true realization of their spirits. The Catholic philosophers of state, who are called Romantics in Germany because they were conservative or reactionary and idealized medieval conditions, de Maistre, Bonald and Donoso Cortés, would probably have considered an eternal conversation more a fantasy product of gruesome comedy, for what distinguishes their counter-revolutionary philosophy of state is the awareness that the times demand a decision, and with an energy that increased to the extreme between the two revolutions of 1789 and 1848, the concept of decision came to the center of their thinking. Wherever the Catholic philosophy of the 19th century expresses itself in spiritually current terms, it has in some form expressed the thought that a great alternative imposes itself, which no longer permits mediation. No medium, says Cardinal Newman, between Catholicity and atheism. They all formulate a big either/or, whose rigor sounds more like dictatorship than an eternal conversation. With concepts such as tradition and custom and with the recognition that history progresses slowly, the Restoration fought against the activist spirit of the Revolution. Such ideas could lead to the complete negation of natural reason and to an absolute moral passivity that considers it evil to act at all. Traditionalism has been theologically refuted by J. Lupus and Father Chassel, by the latter, by the way, with references to the Sentimentalisme Allemand, German sentimentalism, which is supposed to be the source of such errors. In the final analysis, extreme traditionalism actually meant an irrational rejection of any intellectually conscious decision. Nevertheless, Bonald, the founder of traditionalism, is far from the idea of an eternal, self-evolving becoming. His spirit, however, has a different structure than that of de Maistre or even Donoso Cortés. He often shows himself to be surprisingly German. Never, however, does his belief in tradition become something like Schelling's philosophy of nature, Adam Muller's mixture of opposites, or Hegel's belief in history. For Bonald, tradition is the only way to gain the content that the metaphysical belief of man can accept, because the individual's mind is too weak and wretched to recognize the truth on its own. What a contrast to each of those three Germans is revealed in the frightful image which, according to Bonald, is supposed to represent the path of mankind through history, a herd of blind people, led by a blind man who feels his way along with a cane. In truth, even the antitheses and distinctions which Bonald loves so much and which have earned him the name of a scholastic, contain moral disjunctions, by no means polarities of Schelling's natural philosophy, which have a point of indifference, or merely dialectical negations of the historical process. Je m'y trouve constamment entre deux abîmes, je marche toujours entre l'être et le néant. I find myself constantly between two abysses, I walk always between being and nothingness. It is the opposites of good and evil, God and devil, between which there is a life and death either/or, which knows no synthesis and no higher third. De Maistre speaks with particular fondness of sovereignty, which to him essentially means decision. The value of the state is that it makes a decision, the value of the church that it is the last unappealable decision. Infallibility is for him the essence of the unappealable decision, and the infallibility of the spiritual order is of the same nature as the sovereignty of the state order. The two words infallibility and sovereignty are parfaitement synonyms, perfectly synonymous, du Pape, chapter 1. Every sovereignty acts as if it were infallible, every government is absolute, a sentence that an anarchist could have uttered just as literally, though with a completely different intention. The clearest antithesis that occurs in the whole history of political ideas lies in such a sentence. All anarchist theories, from Babeuf to Bakunin, Kropotkin, and Otto Gross, revolve around one axiom: le peuple est bon et le magistrat corruptible, the people are good and the magistrate corruptible. De Maistre, on the other hand, declares authority as such good, if only it exists, tout gouvernement est bon lorsqu'il est établi, all government is good once it is established. The reason is that a decision is inherent in the mere existence of an official authority, and the decision is valuable in and of itself, because in the most important matters, it is more important that decisions be made, than how they are made. Notre interne point, qu'une question soit décidée de telle ou telle manière, mais qu'elle le soit sans retard et sans appel, it is not in our interest for a matter to be decided in one way or another, but for it to be decided without delay and without appeal. In practice it is the same to him, not to be subject to error and not to be accused of error. The essential thing is that no higher authority reviews the decision. Just as revolutionary radicalism was infinitely deeper and more consequential in the proletarian revolution of 1848 than in the revolution of the Third Estate of 1789, so the intensity of the decision increased in the political philosophy of the counter-revolution. Only in this way can the development from de Maistre to Donoso-Cortés, from legitimacy to dictatorship, be understood. This radical increase is manifested in the increasing significance of axiomatic theses on human nature. Every political idea somehow takes a position on the nature of man and assumes that he is either good by nature or evil by nature. With pedagogical or economic explanations one can only appear to evade the question. For the rationalism of the Enlightenment, man was stupid and crude by nature, but educable. Thus his ideal of legal despotism was justified on educational grounds. Uneducated humanity is educated by a legislator, who, according to Rousseau's social contract, is capable of changer la nature de l'homme, changing the nature of man, or unruly nature is conquered by Fichte's coercion and the state becomes, as Fichte calls it with naive brutality, an education factory. Marxist socialism considers the question of the nature of man to be irrelevant and superfluous, because it holds that economic and social conditions change people as well. In contrast, for the consciously atheistic anarchists, man is decidedly good and all evil is the consequence of theological thought and its derivatives, including all ideas of authority, state, and government. In the social contract, with whose constructions of the theory of state de Maistre and Bonald are primarily concerned, man is by no means good by nature. Only in Rousseau's later novels does the famous Rousseauan thesis of the good man unfold, as Ernest Sayre excellently demonstrated. Donoso-Cortés, on the other hand, was opposed to Proudhon, whose anti-theological anarchism consistently had to proceed from that axiom of the good man, while the Catholic Christian proceeded from the dogma of original sin. But Donoso-Cortés radicalized this polemically into a doctrine of the absolute sinfulness and depravity of human nature, for the Tridentine dogma of original sin is not simply radical. Contrary to the Lutheran view, it does not speak of unworthiness, but only of distortion, clouding, wounding, and leaves the possibility of natural goodness intact. Abbé Gadoul, who criticized Donoso-Cortés from a dogmatic point of view, was therefore right to raise dogmatic objections to the exaggeration of the natural evil and unworthiness of man. Nevertheless, it was probably an injustice to overlook that for Cortes this was about a religious and political decision of immense topicality, not the elaboration of a dogma. When he talks about the natural wickedness of man, he polemically opposes atheistic anarchism and its axiom of the good man. He means gamma omega nu iota kappa sigma, adverbially, and not delta omicron gamma mu alpha tau iota kappa sigma, dogmatically. Although he seems to agree with Lutheran dogma here, his attitude is different from that of the Lutheran, who bows to every authority. Here too he retains the self-confident greatness of a spiritual descendant of grand inquisitors. Admittedly, what he says about the natural depravity and meanness of man is more horrible than anything that an absolutist philosophy of state has ever put forward to justify a strict governance. Even de Maistre could be frightened by the wickedness of man, and his utterances about human nature have a power that comes from illusionless morality and solitary psychological experiences. Bonald is no more mistaken about the fundamentally evil instincts of man and recognized the ineradicable will to power as well as any modern psychology. But that is nothing compared to the outbursts of Donoso. His contempt for men knows no bounds, their blind minds, their weak wills, the ridiculous élan of their carnal desires seem so pitiful to him that all the words of all human languages do not suffice to express the complete lowliness of this creature. Had God not become man, the reptile that my foot tramples would be less contemptible than a man. El reptil que piso con mis pies, seria a mis ojos menos despreciable que el hombre. The stupidity of the masses is as astounding to him as the stupid vanity of their leaders. His consciousness of sin is universal, more terrible than that of a Puritan. No Russian anarchist has expressed his assertion that man is good with so much elementary conviction as the Spanish Catholic expressed the answer, "De donde sabe que es noble si Dios no se lo ha dicho?" How does he know that he is good if God has not told him so? The despair of this man, namely in the letters to his friend Count Rachinsky, is often close to madness. According to his philosophy of history, the victory of evil is self-evident and natural, and only a miracle of God can avert it. The images in which his impression of human history is objectified are full of dread and horror. Humanity staggers blindly through a labyrinth whose entrance, exit and structure no one knows, and this is what we call history. Obras de Don Juan Donoso Cortes v. page 192. Humanity is a ship that is thrown aimlessly around the sea, loaded with a rebellious, vulgar, forcibly recruited crew that roars and dances until God's wrath pushes the rebellious rabble into the sea so that silence may reign again. Obras de Don Juan Donoso Cortes 4, page 102. But the typical picture is a different one, the bloody decisive battle that has flared up today between Catholicism and atheistic socialism. It is, according to Donoso, in the essence of bourgeois liberalism not to decide in this struggle, but to try to start a discussion instead. He defines the bourgeoisie precisely as una classe discutidora, a discussing class. Its judgment is thus pronounced, since this means it wishes to avoid a decision. A class that shifts all political activity to discussion, in the press and parliament, is no match for a time of social struggle. Everywhere one can see the inner insecurity and half-heartedness of this liberal bourgeoisie of the July monarchy. Their liberal constitutionalism tries to paralyze the king through parliament, but to leave him on the throne, the same inconsistency that deism commits when it shuts God out from the world, but still clings to his existence. Here Donoso takes over from Bonald the immeasurably fruitful parallel of metaphysics and state theory. So the liberal bourgeoisie wants a god but he should not be able to become active, it wants a monarch but he should be powerless, it demands freedom and equality and yet restriction of the right to vote to the propertied classes, in order to secure for education and property their necessary influence on legislation. As if education and property gave a right to oppress poor and uneducated people, it abolishes the aristocracy of the blood and of the family and yet allows the outrageous rule of the money aristocracy, the stupidest and most vulgar form of aristocracy. It does not want the sovereignty of the king or that of the people. So, what does it actually want? The peculiar contradictions of this liberalism have been noticed not only by reactionaries like Donoso and F.J. Stahl, and not only by revolutionaries like Marx and Engels. Rather, the rare case has arisen that in a concrete political situation one can confront a bourgeois German scholar of Hegelian education with a Spanish Catholic, because both, of course without mutual influence, find the same inconsistencies, and then, due to their different evaluations, enter into a contrast of the most beautifully typological clarity. In his History of the French Social Movements from 1789 to the present, 1850, Lawrence von Stein speaks at length about the liberals. They want a monarch, in other words a personal state authority, an independent will and independent action, but they make the king a mere executive organ and make each of his acts dependent on the approval of the ministry, thus taking that personal element again. They want a king who is above the parties, who should therefore also be above the people's representation. and at the same time they determine that the king may do nothing but carry out the will of this representation. They declare the person of the king to be inviolable and yet make him swear an oath on the Constitution, so that a violation of the Constitution is possible but cannot be prosecuted. No human ingenuity, says Stein, is keen enough to resolve this contradiction conceptually. For a party such as the liberal one, which prides itself on its rationalism, this must be doubly peculiar. A Prussian conservative like F.J. Stahl, who in his lectures on the present parties in state and church dealt with the many contradictions of constitutional liberalism, has a very simple explanation: hatred of the monarchy and aristocracy pushes the liberal bourgeoisie towards the left, anxiety over its property being threatened by radical democracy and socialism pushes it back towards the right to a powerful kingdom, whose military can protect it. Thus he wavers between his two enemies and would like to betray both. Lawrence von Stein's explanation was entirely different. He answers with the reference to life and recognizes the fullness of life precisely in its many contradictions. The insoluble blurring of the hostile elements into each other, that is precisely the true character of all living things. Every being contains its opposite. Pulsating life consists in continuous penetration, the opposing forces, and in fact they are only really opposing when they are cut out of life. He then compares the interpenetration of opposites with the process of organic nature and personal life and says of the state that it also has personal life. It is part of the essence of life to create ever new contrasts and ever new harmonies slowly from oneself, etc., etc. De Maistre and Donoso Cortés were incapable of such organic thinking. De Maistre proved it with his total lack of understanding of Schelling's philosophy of life. Donoso was horrified when he saw Hegelianism face to face in Berlin in 1849. Both were diplomats and politicians of great experience and practice and made sensible enough compromises. But systematic and metaphysical compromise was incomprehensible to them. Suspending the decision at the crucial point by denying that anything at all was to be decided must have seemed to them a strange pantheistic confusion. That liberalism, with its inconsistencies and compromises, lives for Cortés only in the short interim in which it is possible to answer the question Christ or Barabbas? With a motion to adjourn or the appointment of a commission of inquiry. Such an attitude is not accidental but based on liberal metaphysics. The bourgeoisie is the class of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and comes precisely to these freedoms not come from any psychological and economic condition, from commercial thinking, or the like. It has long been known that the idea of liberal freedoms originated in the North American states. Even if in more recent times Georg Jelinek has demonstrated the North American origin of these freedoms, this is a thesis that would hardly have surprised the Catholic state philosopher, as little, incidentally, as it would have surprised Karl Marx, the author of the essay on the Jewish question. Even the economic postulates, freedom of trade and commerce, are, for a decidedly historical investigation of ideas, only derivatives of a metaphysical core. Donoso sees in his radical spirituality always only the theology of the opponent. He by no means theologizes, no ambiguous, mystical combinations and analogies, no Orphic oracle. The letters on current political questions reveal a sober, often cruel lack of illusions and no use for quixotism. In his systematic trains of thought that was attempt to reach the concision of good dogmatic theology. Therefore his intuition in spiritual matters is often striking. The definition of the bourgeoisie as a classe discutidora and the realization that its religion lies in freedom of speech and freedom of the press are examples of this. I do not hold this to be the last word on the whole thing, but rather the most astounding aperçu on continental liberalism. Before the system of Marquis Condorcet, for example, whose typical meaning Wohlzendorf, perhaps out of a kindred spirit, recognized and excellently described, one must really believe that the ideal of political life consists in the fact that not only the legislative body, but the whole population discusses, human society is transformed into an enormous club, and the truth thus arises of its own accord through voting. Donoso holds that this is only a method of avoiding responsibility and giving excessive importance to freedom of speech and freedom of the press, so that one does not have to decide in the end. Just as liberalism discusses and negotiates in every political detail, it also wants to dissolve the metaphysical truth into a discussion. Its essence is negotiation, wait and see half measures, with the hope that the definitive debate, the bloody decisive battle, could be transformed into a parliamentary debate and could be suspended forever by an eternal discussion. Dictatorship is the opposite of discussion. It pertains to the decisionism of the spirit of Donoso Cortés to always take the extreme case, to anticipate the last judgment. That is why he disdains the liberals, while respecting atheistic anarchistic socialism as his mortal enemy and giving it a diabolical greatness. In Proudhon he believes he sees a demon. Proudhon laughed about it and, alluding to the Inquisition, as if he felt he was already being burned at the stake, he called out to Donoso, "Illume." Ignite It, edition in later editions of Les Confessions d'un Révolutionnaire, 1849, later editions 1876, 1929. But the Satanism of that time was not a casual paradox, but rather a strong intellectual principle. Its literary expression is the exaltation of Satan, the père adoptif de ceux qui se noir colère, du paradis terrestre chassés du le père, the adoptive father of those whom God the Father cast out of the earthly paradise in his dark anger, and of the fratricide Cain, while Abel is the bourgeois, chauffant son ventre à son foyer patriarcal, warming his belly at his patriarchal hearth. Race de Cain, ô ciel monte. Et sur la terre yet adieu. These descendants of Cain ascend to heaven, and on earth throw down God. Baudelaire. But this position could not be maintained, because at first it contained only a reversal of the roles of God and the devil. Compared to the later anarchists, Proudhon is also still a moralizing petty bourgeois who clings to the authority of the family father and the principle of the monogamous family. Bakunin was the first to give the fight against theology the full consequence of an absolute naturalism. He too wants to spread Satan, and in contrast to Karl Marx, who despised any kind of religion, he considers this to be the only real revolution. But his intellectual significance rests on his idea of life, which, by virtue of its natural rightness, creates the right forms by itself, of itself. For him, therefore, there is nothing negative and evil but the theological doctrine of God and sin, which stamps man as a villain in order to have a pretext for its imperiousness and lust for power. All moral evaluations lead to theology and to an authority that artificially imposes an alien, extrinsic ought on the natural and immanent truth and beauty of human life, whose source is greed and lust for power and whose result is a general corruption of those who exercise power as well as those over whom it is exercised. When today anarchists see the patriarchy and monogamy-based family as the actual state of sin and preach a return to matriarchy, the alleged paradisal primordial state, a stronger awareness of the deepest connections is expressed in this than in that laughter of Proudhon. Such final consequences, such as the dissolution of the patriarchy-based family, are always on Donoso's mind, because he sees that the moral disappears with the theological, the political idea with the moral, and every moral and political decision is paralyzed in a paradisal mortal world of immediate, natural life and problem-free corporeality. Today there is nothing more modern than the struggle against the political. American financiers, industrial technicians, Marxist socialists, and anarcho-syndicalist revolutionaries unite in the demand that the non-objective rule of politics over the objectivity of economic life must be eliminated. They insist there ought to be only organizational, technical and economic sociological tasks, but no more political problems. The kind of economic and technical thinking that prevails today is no longer able to perceive a political idea. The modern state really seems to have become what Max Weber sees in it, a large business. A political idea is generally only understood when it has been possible to prove that a group of people has a plausible economic interest in using it to its advantage. If the political disappears into economic or technical organizational, it melts away on the other side in the eternal conversation of cultural and historical philosophical generalities, which, by aesthetic characterizations, accept an epoch as classical, romantic or baroque. In both, the core of the political idea, the demanding moral decision, is circumvented. But the current significance of those counter-revolutionary philosophers of state lies in the consistency with which they decide. They heighten the moment of decision so much that it finally overrides the idea of legitimacy from which they started. As soon as Donoso Cortés realized that the time of the monarchy was over because there were no more kings and no one would have the courage to be king other than by the will of the people, he brought his decisionism to a conclusion, that is, he demanded a political dictatorship. Already in the quoted statements of de Maistre there was a reduction of the state to the moment of decision, and consequently to a pure, non-reasoning and non-discussing, unapologetic, i.e. created from nothing, absolute decision. But that is essentially dictatorship, not legitimacy. Donoso was convinced that the moment of the final battle had come. In the face of radical evil there is only one dictatorship, and the legitimist idea of succession becomes at such a moment empty self-righteousness. Thus the opposites, authority and anarchy, could confront each other with absolute decisiveness and form the clear antithesis mentioned above. When de Maistre says that every government is necessarily absolute, an anarchist literally says the same thing, only he draws the opposite practical conclusion with the help of his axiom of the good man and corrupt government, that every government must be fought precisely because every government is dictatorship. Every pretension of a decision must be evil for the anarchist, because the right thing comes automatically if the immanence of life is not disturbed by such pretensions. Of course, this radical antithesis compels him to decide decisively against decision, and in the case of the greatest anarchist of the 19th century, Bakunin, The strange paradox arises that he had to become theoretically the theologian of anti-theology and in practice the dictator of anti-dictatorship.